Okay, welcome. So today I want to talk a little bit about media, both in the UK and globally, trauma and their portrayal of trauma, and also this idea of being and becoming trauma informed with their messages. So enjoy. Okay, so I have been doing quite a lot of research recently. I was just reading Robert Verkaik's book today. Among other things, I've been listening to different things, and I'm really fascinated at the moment. My mind's been blown a bit. I reached out to a journalist last week. One of the people who'd come on my podcast sent me an article, and as I was reading it, we were talking about this idea that many of the issues we've currently got going on in the world, like the environment, the head of the UN, she's now retired from the UN, but who was involved with climate control and climate crisis, she's now speaking up about that actually it's to do with trauma and this idea of collective trauma, that's the key that we have to heal. And when I was listening and reading this, it was like, oh my God, that's amazing. And it comes from the work of Thomas Hubl, who is he runs retreats and works with groups around this idea of collective trauma healing. So I've noticed over the last few months that I've been consuming quite a lot of media about what's been going on with the cost of living crisis, the energy crisis, and I just noticed I had quite negative thoughts. And the last 2-3 weeks, I've just had a bit of a fast, focused on my learning with boarding school trauma, but I've stopped watching the media coverage. And I've noticed I felt a lot better. And what I wanted to focus on a bit today is this idea that why is it that the media, it often feels quite traumatic to sometimes watch the media, and just some ideas, some hypotheses I have around this, and joining some dots. So what Robert Verkaik is talking about, he's saying that according to the Sutton report, so this is on page 297 of his book, is it? The Sutton Trust found that half of 100 leading journalists in the UK are privately educated. Now, what this means is that, and what he's saying is that, they have a particular message. Yeah. And what they're also saying is the Sutton Trust also looked at editors of 22 of the country's leading newspapers, and 41% of those posts were held by people who had either been to boarding school or private school. So why that's important, and this is the idea of being trauma informed, but also linking in the work of Nick Duffell. Nick Duffell, when I went to interview him a few weeks ago, who's written the book Wounded Leaders, he says the media is dominated by the sort of people who have had this type of education, so he means boarding school education. They frame that discourse in that way, so we're told how we should think and feel. So this idea that media, if half of them have been to boarding school, and what he means by this sort of education, he talks earlier on in the interview about that the symptoms of someone who's been to boarding school, he calls them survivors. He says everyone has to survive. Conflict, workaholism, they dissociate. The boarding school tends to live a split life, and they don't have emotional intelligence. So what's happening, and this is my hypothesis, is that we have these people who, the head of the BBC and of Channel 4 at this moment have been to boarding school. So the hypothesis is their lens, if they've not yet worked through this, is coming from this survivor's perspective. They're still running unconsciously these programs of conflict, workaholism, split life, no emotional intelligence. That's what they want to put out into the world, because that's what's running unconsciously. So Nick Duffell talks about this, this idea that it's the little boys inside these leaders who are running the show. Yeah. So, they had to suppress their vulnerability. And Nick said as well in the interview, he said, this idea of vulnerability, so you've disowned the whole concept of vulnerability. It's foreign to you after a while. This is for an ex-boarder. So how on earth are you going to be able to understand the vulnerable in society? How on earth are you going to have empathy for them? Well, it's very, very difficult, hardly possible. So if you think these people who are running the media, so Rupert Murdoch, he was at Geelong boarding school, grammar school in Australia. So again, he kind of runs most of the UK's media companies, The Sun, I can't remember the others, Sky News. It's kind of coming through that lens, and they're not going to be able to understand the vulnerability of people. So where am I really going with this? It's just this idea that if you notice that, I'm not feeling very positive, all of this stuff is doom mongering, it's like to realize, these people, it's like they're dumping. And why I wanted to kind of bring in the work of Thomas Hubl, he says that, and this was in his interview on the Collective Trauma Healing Summit 2022, it was the lady who was interviewing him saying the role that media has to play is really control, is central. When we think of how we grow, how we expand our awareness, part of that is where do we take our attention? And when we think of society as a body, to me, the role that media plays is the function of determining where our attention goes collectively. And there could be a profoundly supportive role that media does play. Yeah. So again, it could be a positive thing, but at the moment, if you're watching it, you don't feel very uplifted like I haven't been feeling. It's sometimes right. I need to be aware of what's going on, but not to become inundated, because it's like this trauma, it's too much. And what Thomas Hubl says is more people get traumatized by the news, so they either shut down or get more fearful. And to put this into context, I can't remember the university who did this research, but in America during the Boston bombing, they found that if you watched more than 6 hours of news coverage, you were more traumatized than if you'd actually been in the bombing. And that's incredible. So if you're noticing that, I'm spending 6 hours a week or 6 hours a day looking at this stuff about what's going on with the cost of living or with the energy crisis, you are becoming more traumatized than actually if you are struggling with the cost of living. Yeah. So I think this is important to realize that, I need to get back outside, go for my walk. What kind of settles your nervous system, your fight, flight, freeze response? Could be breath. It could be meeting friends. It could be, a warm bath. These are the things which take us into rest and digest, rather into the overstimulating the amygdala, the limbic system. What other things does he say? So this is the solution, really, is that we become trauma-informed in our media, trauma-informed journalism, and this idea of being informed in a regulated way. So he says sensational media is constantly triggering trauma response and trauma triggers. What we need to start doing is, how do we regulate our trauma response and learn how to regulate? And what Thomas Hubl's talking about is this idea that, yes, to tell people about stuff, but not to, go on and on and on and on and on without giving some ways of dealing with it. And being aware, actually, if I show that person, in the state they're in, that wouldn't be appropriate, coming from a heart-centered place. And then finally, just to bring this all together, realize this has been maybe a bit disjointed, this talk. Finally, I spoke on Monday to one of the UK's leading psychologists and psychotherapists, Martin Lloyd Elliott, who's a best-selling author. And he was saying that he works with super teams. So that might be the SAS or in politics or in big business. And he says he's now realizing that, or maybe he's realized for a while, that's me adding that in, is the importance of connecting to our hearts. In order to be a super team, you've got to be heart-centered. And that's what I feel with the media. We need to invite our media to drop back down into their hearts, to feeling again, to connecting with their vulnerability. So I feel, the shifts, the changes could happen very quickly as we become more trauma informed. So I think it's a very positive time. So yes, the interview with Martin will be going live on Friday. And then while that's going live, I'm also interviewing Petter Sandgren, who is a professor of education at Stockholm University, to talk about his thesis, Globalizing Eton, and about how the boarding schools of the UK have spread around the world and what he feels that impact is. So yeah, exciting times. I love that we have the Joe Rogans, the Jordan Peterson, who are trauma informed. They are giving information, and that we've got different choices for where we can watch, but also being aware, actually, I just need to have a break from media at the moment. I need just to come back to my meditation practice, to my exercise, to my family. So, okay, many blessings. Hope you have a wonderful day. Any questions, please let me know.